Okay, it looks like a few more people have joined. We'll get up and running. Welcome to everyone. My name is Jeremy Cook. I'm a Content Solutions Director here at Cloud Academy, and it's my pleasure to present to you the following webinar, which is Crushing the CKAD Exam, Certified Kubernetes Application Developer. Again, I'll just do a quick introduction. I'm Jeremy Cook. I'm a Content Solutions Director here at Cloud Academy. I also wear the hat of being the DevOps subject matter expert and team lead. I have a background in DevOps, cloud, Kubernetes, security, machine learning, software engineering in various languages, etc. I'm Kubernetes certified. I've passed the CKAD exam a couple of times. I've passed the CKA and CKS exams. This session will run for approximately 60 minutes. The last 10 to 15 minutes will be put aside for a live Q&A session. So feel free to register any questions you may have during the webinar within the chat panel, and I'll attempt to address as many of these before we finish. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available later for on-demand viewing. Okay, I'll quickly provide a review of Cloud Academy for those who may not have used us before. We're an online skills intelligence platform complete with an extensive digital library for learning, covering diverse topics such as cloud, DevOps, containers, AI, ML, security, software engineering, and a whole lot more, and of course, Kubernetes. So the agenda for this webinar will be the following. I'm going to run through the exam format first, the workstation setup, tips and tricks will make up the majority of the webinar. As mentioned, we'll do the Q&A at the end, and then finally we'll cover next steps. So the exam format. So it's a performance-based exam. So you will be working in a web-based terminal performing a number of operations to complete tasks given. And the great thing about this type of exam is the interest factor is really high. I found this type of exam really cool when compared to, say, other exams that are, say, multi-choice format. The fact that you're actually operating and having to perform commands on a Kubernetes cluster to prove you have the skills required to pass the CKAD exam, it's such a cool exam. So yeah, great thing to have in terms of a pass on your resume. Now the CKAD exam currently operates on version 1.22 of the Kubernetes cluster release. It also uses the same version for the Kubectl utility that you need to use. So 1.22 was released in, I believe, end of August 2021, and this is still current as of January 2022. So when you're preparing and practicing for the exam, make sure you're preparing and practicing on the version 1.22. The exam is an open book exam. So what this means is you have access to the following online links. So you're able to go to these websites, which you can then leverage the documentation on them. Now I've highlighted the first one, which is the kubernetes.io/docs documentation site. Now, really in the exam, you really only need to access this one. The other ones are able to be accessed, but I found absolutely no requirement to use the bottom three. The first one is the core documentation site within the kubernetes.io domain. And as I'll show you later on, what you should do is bookmark to relevant sections within that documentation. So when you're in the exam, you can have an extra browser tab open. That means you can have two at most. The first one will be the one that holds the web-based terminal session that you'll be operating and performing your commands within. The second browser tab can open up any of the pages within these domains and subdomains. In terms of the structure of the CKAD exam, there are 5 domains. This is based on the newer version of the CKAD exam as released end of September 2021. So there are 5 domains. The first domain is application design and build, 20%. Second domain is application deployment, 20%. 15% for application observability and maintenance. 25% for application environment configuration and security. And the last domain is 20% services and networking. So back in September 2021, they made a newer version of the exam, and these are the domains for that newer version. In the previous exam, there were 7 domains, and really all I've done is to collapse the 7 domains into the following 5 domains. In terms of number of questions and the exam time, you will be expected to answer 17 questions within 2 hours. So you have 120 minutes to answer 17 questions. The questions can be attempted in any order, and each question carries a different weight. Weights can be from I believe 2% through to 10%. So in terms of the way you work within the exam, you can go through it sequentially from first question to last question, or you can use a different strategy, which is to answer the exam questions which carry the higher weights. It's entirely up to you which approach you use. I tended to use a mixture of both. So I would start at the first question and keep working through. I would put aside any questions where I felt I needed to spend a bit more time on them. I would take note of those, put them into the notepad, into the provided notepad, and then come back to those ones at the end of having gone through the full set. In terms of a pass mark, 66% is required to pass the exam and become CKAD certified. When you sign up for the exam, you get 2 exam takes. So do not stress about failing on the first exam take if you so happen to do so. My tip to you is to fairly early on schedule the second exam take, meaning you still have the knowledge of what you experienced in the first one fresh in mind, and in between the 2 exam takes, you can review the areas that you feel you need to become a little bit stronger on. Okay, importantly, we'll cover off the exam workstation setup. So when you sit the exam, there are certain conditions that you need to meet. Obviously, some of these are obvious. First one being the room that you sit the exam within needs to be empty. No one else can be in the room at all times. This is a proctored exam, so when you begin the exam, you will have a proctor online who will have access to your video camera and microphone. They will ask you to pan around your room such that they can confirm no one's in the room, confirm that there's no notes on the wall. They'll even ask you to video the desktop that you're working on and underneath the desk. It seems to be that they always do this. I've always had the same questions asked. It's just what the proctors have to go through in terms of their script. In terms of computer OS, you can do Windows, Mac OS, Linux. The main requirement is the browser itself. The Linux Foundation, who administer the exam, recommend that you use Chrome, and there is a Chrome plugin that you need to install to confirm that the browser and access to the video cam and mic cam are all correctly set up pre-taking the exam. I'll also make mention of Vivaldi later on as a backup browser. Internet obviously needs to be reliable. When you take the exam, you should kick off everyone within the local household off the internet. You want to make sure that you have all the bandwidth available for the exam experience. As mentioned already, microphone and webcam need to be enabled. And probably the most important one and highly recommended is to have an external monitor connected into your laptop or computer. And the reason for this is you can have that extra browser tab positioned on the external monitor, sourcing any of the online open book documentation that you're allowed to have access to. So on the computer or laptop itself, you'll open up the web-based terminal where you'll be performing the commands, and on your external monitor, you'll have access to the documentation. And that kind of configuration really optimizes and speeds you through performing answering the 17 questions. In the past, that external monitor configuration was a little bit contentious. It was neither mentioned as being allowed or not allowed, but it definitely is allowed from my recent resits on the exams. As mentioned, Chrome is the recommended browser. Having said that, there's a case for installing Vivaldi, as if there is a problem with Chrome accessing your microphone or camera, the proctor at the other end will recommend that you install Vivaldi. So rather than being pained and having to do that, if this happens, install Vivaldi before you go into the exam, if you can do so. As briefly mentioned before, there is a compatibility check plugin that you will need to install into your browser. Again, this will double check that you have all of the right configuration available before you actually log into the exam itself and perform the exam. So you need to install that plugin and run it and make sure that the status checks will pass for each of the components. Now, for those who have never taken a Kubernetes CKAD exam or CKA or CKS exam and are unfamiliar with what to expect, the Linux Foundation have recorded a brief video which demonstrates the exam interface. And it's highly recommended that you go and have a look at that so that you know what to anticipate beforehand in terms of what the exam environment will look like. So go to YouTube, search for Kubernetes Certification Exam Environment Preview, or go to the link highlighted here. As earlier mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available very shortly after it finishes. So even if you forget these tips, you'll have access to them if you watch the webinar on demand again. Okay, and in terms of exam preparation, you really will help yourself if you understand the fundamentals and the theory behind Kubernetes. Now, in terms of that, we've got you covered. Cloud Academy has got some great content assets for Kubernetes. We've got the Introduction to Kubernetes learning path, and we've also got a certified Kubernetes application developer learning path, which is very much focused on providing you with all of the necessary theory that you'll require to pass the exam. We also have a number of hands-on labs, and in particular, we've built a set of CKAD practice exam focused labs. So it's our recommendation that for you to prepare and really give yourself the best chance of passing, take these hands-on labs. You can take them multiple times, and they will really prepare you really well for doing the hands-on activities in the exam itself. Additionally, I would recommend that you install Minikube on your local workstation, and this will give you a local Kubernetes cluster into which you can practice and prepare, playing around with all of the different resources, all of the developer-focused activities that you might expect to encounter within the exam. Minikube is a superb piece of kit for really testing Kubernetes and getting familiar with Kubernetes. One thing to highlight is that when you start up Minikube and you start up your local Kubernetes cluster, use the -- Kubernetes - version parameter and set it to be version 1.22.0, which is the version you'll be tested on in the CKAD exam. Another tip is performing a set of online CKAD exercises found here. This repository has a lot of complementary exercises, hands-on exercises that you can do within, say, your Minikube cluster setup. If you complete all of these, as well as our hands-on labs as previously reviewed, you'll be in good shape to pass. And finally, any exam taker who signs up for the CKAD exam will be given access to the following exam simulator at killer.sh. Killer.sh have done a great job of providing a simulator which is very much modeled on what you'll expect in the real exam setup. The exam simulator is provided by killer.sh. They provide 2 sessions free that come with your exam sign up. It's recommended that you go through them, and again, you'll really increase your chances of passing. Okay, so now that we've started our exam session, the next kind of set of tips are really about setting up the tools that you'll use within that exam session. And the first one is auto completion on the Kubectl command. Now, as highlighted here in the newer version of the exam, release September 2021, this is already enabled by default. So you do not have to, as previously you did in the earlier exams, set this up yourself. Having said that, it's still good to know how to do this. And the command above the highlighted section here, Kubectl completion bash, with the redirection operator into the source command, is the overall command to set up auto completion. Auto completion will help you speed through doing the solving the questions that you're presented with. I cannot overemphasize how important it is to be familiar with auto completion and to leverage it within the exam. So once you have it enabled, typing the Kubectl and then double tabbing will show you all of the subcommands. When you choose a subcommand and you double tab again, it's context aware, and you'll see the subcommands for the subcommand previously chosen. So in the example shown here, you've done Kubectl, you double tab, you've then you've selected the get subcommand. You then enter the namespace that you want to operate in, and then the resource you want to operate on, in this case pods, and then you can double tab again and see the full parameter set for the pods resource. Again, yeah, auto completion will help you navigate through and get through the questions really quickly. So in the following screenshots, this is just showing you that double tabbing approach. So the first, what I've done here is I've done Kubectl, double tab, and I can see all of the subcommands available: annotate, API resources, apply, attach, all the way through to the uncalled-in version. I then select create and double tab again, and I can see all of the subcommands for the create command. I'll choose secret and double tab again, and I can see the subcommands for the secret command. I'll select the generic command, and then I'll enter the name of the secret that I'm going to create, and then dash dash, and I can double tab again and pull up all of the parameters for the Kubectl create secret generic command. So you get this guidance when using auto completion. It's extremely helpful when you're in a pressurized exam situation. So again, just emphasizing another example of Kubectl, this time the create deployment command. I've done dash dash image and set it to the Nginx container image. I've then gone dash dash and done double tab, and I can see all of the parameters for the current command. So again, extremely useful, and you should very much use it in your exam situation. A kind of more generalist exam tip is to prefer the imperative commands over the declarative command sets. So the imperative commands are the ones where you can literally use Kubectl to create a resource in the cluster. Preferring the imperative commands will again address the kind of time pressures that you'll encounter in the exam. You have 2 hours and you need to get through 17 questions as quickly as possible. So keep that in mind that when possible, preference imperative over declarative. Having said that, you will not be able to solve all 17 questions using the imperative version commands solely. There will be instances or questions where you will need to use the declarative or manifest-based versions of performing the solution. And I'll get to how you can use the declarative versions again in an optimal manner. When working with Kubectl, keep in mind that many of the resources have shortened versioned names. The example shown here, PO for pod, deploy for deployment, CM for config map, and importantly, the ones that you probably really should use rather than using their full names are the bottom 2, PV for persistent volume and PVC for persistent volume claim. To know of the full set of resource aliases, run the kubectl API-resources command. That will list out all of the available shortened alias versions. The bottom 2, PV and PVC, again, when you're in a time-pressured exam situation, it's much quicker to type PV than persistent volume, and even more so PVC than persistent volume claim. Again, little tips to address the time pressures of the exam. Okay, as mentioned, some of the questions that you'll need to solve, you will need to drop into manifests. In terms of editing and updating manifests, my tip is to use Vim. You don't need to use Vim. I believe you can use any of the other available editors within the web-based terminal. By the way, the web-based terminal runs on top of Ubuntu and I believe 18.04. So be familiar with that operating system because that is the one you'll be working within when presented the web-based terminal in the exam. Now, as mentioned, I like to use Vim for editing manifest files. The following tip here is to set up your local .vimrc file with the following Vim-related commands. So set paste and number. Set paste will make sure that when you copy manifest text, perhaps from the kubernetes.io documentation page into a file, that the indentation is not changed or reformatted. Number, as shown in the screenshot here, will give you line numbering. Important if things go wrong and you get error messages, it is more than likely the error messages will convey the line number where the problem is. And so therefore, when you're editing back within Vim, you can quickly jump to the offending line number. The next config items are TS for tab stop equals 2 and shift width for SW equals 2 and expand tab. So I won't go into great detail about what these ones do, but basically these will make sure that your indentation within your manifests, which need to be in YAML format, are using 2 spaces for the indentation. And then syntax on gives you color coding. So when you're looking at a fairly large manifest file, you can quickly get a sense for the structure within it. So those are my recommendations for setting up Vim if you choose to go with Vim. Now, this is more of a pro tip, and it doesn't need to be used within the CKAD exam. When I did the CKS exam, I certainly found it more useful. And so the pro tip here is to use Tmux, which is a terminal multiplexer. It means you can slice and dice your terminal session into multiple panes. So you can have one pane that is perhaps doing a kubectl get to show you resources within the cluster, and then you can have another pane within which you're actually editing a manifest file. So it allows you to, get more of a user experience out of your one terminal session. As I say, it's more of a pro tip. If you're familiar with Tmux, then use it. If you want to learn about it before the exam, do so, but don't feel you need to use it to pass the exam. If you do decide to use Tmux, then as a basic minimum, understand the following commands. So Control+B and the percent sign will split the pane vertically. Control+B and the double quote will split the pane horizontally. Control+B and the arrow keys will allow you to move between panes. And the Control+B and the colon character will drop you into the Tmux command bar, where you can do a whole heap of other Tmux related configuration. As I say, don't feel you have to learn Tmux to pass the CKAD exam. That's not the case. It's just more of a pro tip. If you're familiar with it, use it. If you want to learn it and then use it. And then one final Tmux related configuration item. In your .tmux.conf file, set up the mouse on option, which will allow you to use your mouse to scroll within individual panes. So if you run some of the kubectl commands, some of them can be very verbose and you may need to scroll back. This command will allow you to do so if you're running within a Tmux terminal session. Okay, the next set of tips are all about finding help. As earlier mentioned, this exam is an open book exam. So you can go to the core kubernetes.io documentation and source help from there. So that is the kubernetes.io docs area. Now, one of the best tips that I've used when I've sat exams is to leverage bookmarks. So before you go into the exam, set up a number of bookmarks that will help you in certain areas that you might anticipate to be tested on within the CKAD exam. So in the screenshot here, you'll see in the bookmarks bar, I've got a set of bookmarks that I've already pre-established and set up within my Chrome browser. I've got the kubectl cheat sheet at hand, label selectors, controllers, generators, limits, probes. That goes through to all of the different areas where you may be tested on. Now, to help out with this, I've actually exported my own bookmarks CKAD set of links, and I've hosted them here for your convenience. So before the exam, go to this repo and download the Kubernetes bookmarks.html file, and then import this into your own browser. Import it not only into Chrome, but also into Vivaldi if you're preparing to anticipate any issues that you may have with your Chrome browser. So yeah, all of the bookmarks that I use to successfully pass the CKAD exam are contained within this export hosted here. These links are not only links to the actual pages, but they're links to anchors or sections directly within the pages. So rather than having to incur the expense of scrolling down to a section, some of the links will actually jump you straight to, say, for example, persistent volumes, if you wanted to get a copy of what a manifest for declaring a persistent volume might look like. Also bear in mind that even though you've set up your bookmarks, there'll be perhaps times where you need to draw upon some documentation from the kubernetes.io website for which you don't have a bookmark for. Then use the search section within kubernetes.io. It's highly usable in the sense that more often than not, the first search item returned is the one that you'll probably be looking for. So in the example shown here, perhaps I've a question that's challenging me on doing some volume setup, and I need to source some information on volumes. I go to the kubernetes.io search and I type in volumes, and the first link here is likely the one that's got the information I need. So leverage the online search within Kubernetes.io when necessary. Back within the terminal session, there's a number of different areas where you can consult help. The first one is using the -- help parameter. So all of the commands as used within kubectl and all of the subcommands and the subcommands of the subcommands, etc., all present a -- help parameter. By all means use this. One of the things that I used quite often when I was sitting the exam is I kind of got into a rhythm of, I would look at the question within the exam. The first thing I would do is I would set the context. So I would make sure that I copy and pasted the cluster that I should be operating on, the namespace that I should be operating within. And then the very next thing I would do is I'd just take a brief look at what they were assessing. And then I would begin by creating a kubectl command. If it was to create something, I would then do -- create. So if it was to create a deployment, I'd do deployment -- help. And then straight away, I've got examples available that the help provides. So in the screenshot shown here, if you do kubectl create -- help, you can see some immediate examples. And you can cut and paste those. Again, this is an open book exam, and you can leverage all of the help available to you. And you should do so, because there's a lot of technique here where you can get through the time-pressured 2 hours very quickly. Okay, so as mentioned, the -- help parameter is context aware. So as you navigate through the kubectl commands, help is always available. So you can do kubectl create -- help. Say if you're building a secret, you could do kubectl create secret -- help. If you were creating a generic secret, you could do kubectl create secret generic -- help. The point is that -- help is always available. A couple of other kind of pro tips. Help can, the -- help parameter can be very verbose. It can print out a lot of help. And again, to navigate quickly to items of interest, you can pipe out that output to other commands, such as more to help you scroll through it, or perhaps to grep to narrow down on parameters that you're interested in. So the bottom one here is I'm doing kubectl run -- help, piping it out to grep, and then searching for requests because I want to set some request limits, and I need to know how to leverage the request parameter. Another area of help, which is more than useful when dealing with manifest files, is the explain subcommand. So kubectl explain can be used to explain the schema structure of any resource. So if you're writing a manifest file, or you need to understand the structure of the manifest file, the hierarchy of the different fields, and the data types for each field, and I guess the intention of what each field actually represents, then use the kubectl explain command. So in the example shown here, I've got kubectl explain pod, and the screenshot shows me the root level fields, the root level hierarchy for the pod resource. A couple of things to drill in on. Notice within the field section, the names of the fields, and right next to it is the data type. So the first one, API version, it's a string data type. Also notice within fields that the field names are capitalized. So we've got API capital V for version. Keep that in mind. So when you're using the explain command, it's important to understand that the field names are camel cased. So a couple more examples of using explain. The first one we've already seen. You can navigate downwards. So first one is showing the root level fields, schema fields for pod. We're then navigating down into spec. So if you run the second command, you'll see all of the field structure for the pod.spec area. Likewise, the next one is pod.spec.containers, And you can keep drilling down basically till you get to a leaf level field name. Another sometimes useful tip is to use the -- recursive parameter on explain. What this will do is it will dump out all of the fields recursively from the starting position. So in the first one shown here, we're doing kubectl explain pod.spec -- recursive. So when you run this command, you would see all of the fields below pod.spec all the way down to the leaf level. Again, this, when you're using -- recursive, it's very verbose. So it's sometimes useful to pipe out to more. I found it kind of useful sometimes to pipe out to grep, do a case insensitive search for the field name. In this case, I'm searching for container port. Doing a case insensitive search because I don't know whether the container port has port beginning with P or not. And then I also leverage the -b20 parameter, which shows me the fields 20 lines previous to the matching line, which will show me the structure beforehand, which is kind of the, more often than not, the kind of interest area because you're trying to set up the structure within the manifest file. Okay, I briefly mentioned earlier on that the cheat sheet within the kubernetes.io docs documentation slide is available. Have that at hand. That is set up in the bookmarks that it's set up as a bookmark within that bookmarks export held within that Cloud Academy bookmarks repo that I earlier presented. So know of that being there, and if needed, jump to it to see that all of the often used kubectl commands. Okay, moving on to working with manifests. So as earlier mentioned, you always want to prefer the imperative command set to create resources, but there will be times within the exam where you need to leverage a manifest file to accomplish a task. Now, one of the techniques that you can leverage to generate as much of that manifest file is to leverage the --dry-run equals client -o output to YAML parameter set. In doing so, what this will do is it will generate the skeleton of what you need to accomplish, and you can then redirect it out to a file on the file system. So in the first command shown here, what I'm doing is I'm using kubectl run to generate a pod resource. I'm setting the container name to nginx. I'm setting the container image to be nginx. And then I'm leveraging dry run and output to YAML and redirecting it out to the file name demo.pod.yaml. Likewise, that dry run can be used on any resource. So in the second example, we're creating a deployment and doing the same thing. Now, rather than having to always type out dry run and output to YAML parameter set, you can export out that section of the command to a variable. In this case, the example here, I've exported it into the variable name dry. And then anytime that I need to leverage dry run, I can just quickly pull up that variable in my command. Again, this addresses the time pressures. So leveraging this tip will help you get through generating manifests quicker. Another technique when working with manifests or when you need to create resources within the cluster is, again, to go back to the online kubernetes.io documentation. Say, for example, you have a question to create a persistent volume. Go to the online documentation. There's a great example of what a manifest will look like for that type of resource. You can then copy it and then go back into your terminal session using a combination of the cat command and the EOF operator. You can quickly copy the raw text out of the documentation, paste it into your terminal, and have a file generated for you. So in this example here, I'm copying the online documentation for the persistent volume manifest. I've done cat. I'm going to output to the pv.yaml file on the file system, and I literally just do copy and paste. Finish with the EOF operator, and then I've got my file. I can then jump into a Vim session and then do some more editing and updating, introducing some more fields, some fine tuning of that manifest file. And then finally, I can create the resource. So this is a very useful technique, again, to do things quickly in the exam session. Another tip that I found highly useful was to briefly suspend and resume editing sessions within Vim. To do so, use the Control+Z key sequence. When you're in a Vim session and you do Control+Z, this will suspend the current Vim session, and then it will drop you back into the terminal. It may be that you need to do some more analysis, some more investigation, some more research within your cluster. You can run any sequence of shell commands, including obviously kubectl. And then once you've sourced some more information, you can then type FG to bring the Vim session back to the foreground. And then you can place, you can complete your editing as per the research you just did on the terminal. So very useful. Okay, the next set of tips is to look at techniques for updating existing resources. So kubectl provides the edit subcommand. Now you can use the edit subcommand to pull up an existing deployed resource. In this case, or this example here, we're doing edit on a pod resource named Nginx. And in particular, we're updating the labels. We're adding a second label, org equal to Cloud Academy. I'm doing this in a Tmux session in one pane. This allows me to perhaps look at another pane where I can see some other information about this particular pod. When I've completed my edits, I save the file using the :x exclamation mark to write it out to the file system. In doing so, this will actually update the resource within the cluster. So know of how to use kubectl edit. It's a very quick way to update existing resources already deployed into the cluster. Next up is the set subcommand. So the set subcommand allows you to do things like perhaps update an image in an existing pod, or update the image in an existing deployment. So in the two sets of examples shown here, the first set is updating the image for a pod, changing the Nginx container image from latest to 1.9.1. And then in the bottom example, we're updating the Nginx container within deployment, and again, using the same container image tag. So kubectl set is a great way to accomplish that type of task and to do it quickly. Okay, moving on to troubleshooting and debugging. This is a fairly quick session, and being mindful of the webinar time that we've got left, I want to keep the last 10 minutes for questions that have been asked by the audience. So we'll go through this section. When things go wrong, there are some commands that kubectl provides that allows you to look at some of the logging and events that have undertaken or been recorded within the cluster. The first of which is the kubectl describe command. So kubectl describe will show a lot of metadata about a particular resource, or a particular named resource, I should say, as well as all of the events specific to that particular resource. So in the example shown here, I've got kubectl describe, and I'm describing on a pod named Skynet. This will bring up a lot of metadata about that particular pod, and at the bottom of the output will be an events section that will show you all of the relevant events for that particular pod. So if you're doing something on a pod and something goes wrong, the pod doesn't start up, use the describe command to get detailed information about perhaps why or what went wrong with launching that pod. Likewise, describe can be used on a whole lot of different services. The two examples shown here are the pod and service resources. This shows an example of doing a describe on a pod named Nginx, and as just mentioned, the screenshot here shows all of the metadata about this particular pod. This is kind of a bit of a pro tip. When you're using describe, use it together with some of the other Linux commands such as grep, awk, sort, unique. So in the example shown here, kubectl describe is being used to describe all pods in the kube-system namespace. We're then grepping for line rows of image colon. This will contain the container image used. We then pipe that out to awk, and we are only interested in the actual image name. And then we pipe it out to sort and eventually out to unique. And eventually what we get is a unique set of container images being used for all of the pods in the kube-system namespace. Now, the point here is not what's been outputted. The point here is learn to leverage the kubectl commands with other Linux commands for doing more powerful things. Another tip is to use kubectl together with logs. If you provide a resource name, pod name in particular, you can pull up logs relevant to that named pod. You can also leverage the -- follow parameter to actually tail on that pod. So, for example, you might have a Tmux session set up. In one pane, you're doing some work on a pod, and another pane, you might be tailing on the pod logs for that particular pod, and you can see the activity within the pod. That kind of configuration is useful, particularly when you're doing multi-container setups. Keep that in mind. In terms of sourcing and troubleshooting, another area of logging information is the kubectl get events command. Now this will pull up logging information at the cluster layer. So everything that happens, particularly at the cluster level, will be recorded and available through the kubectl get events. So keep that as kind of a last resort if you're still not being able to pinpoint exactly which resource is upset or for what reason. Kubectl get events may capture that information that helps you get across the line in terms of troubleshooting. In terms of the final tip for troubleshooting, the kubectl exec command can be used to drop into a running pod. So kubectl exec -it pod name, and then -- you provide it the command. In terms of troubleshooting, you more often than not will want to leverage sh for shell or bash if you want to bring up the bash command and it's available on the pod. This allows you to troubleshoot on the actual running pod, seeing perhaps what's happening within the pod and any troubleshooting that you need to do on the pod itself. So a useful thing to have in the troubleshooting command set. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the webinar in terms of tips and tricks. What I'll do now is I'll address any questions raised during the webinar. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions from the audience. First question is, can you have 2 terminal sessions when you use 2 monitors? The strict answer is no. So if you're setting up your exam environment such that you have your main workstation and you have a second monitor, on the first, regardless of that kind of configuration, you can only have 2 browser tabs open. the first of which will have the running exam session within it. The second browser tab can only have the available links for documentation purposes. So you can only have one literal version of the web-based terminal session up and running. That is the only configuration you can have in respect to that question. Okay, the next question. At what point can you feel confident to schedule the exam? Let's say I finished all of the CKA and CKA learning paths. Okay, good question. You know, there's no right or wrong answer here, but it really comes down to preparation. The more preparation you throw into it, the more confidence you build. And really that question is for you to answer. If you've put enough preparation in terms of doing all the theory, doing all the hands-on labs, using you know, all of the other available resources for doing hands-on activities within a cluster, that will build up confidence for yourself. And it's really a case of you understanding your confidence levels. Having said that, keep in mind that you get 2 exam takes. So when you sign up for any of the Kubernetes exams, you get 2 exam takes. The first of which, you know, hopefully you'll take and pass. But if not, keep in mind that second exam take is there available. So, you know, if you don't pass the first time, a tip to keep in mind in that case is when you come out of the exam, you'll get your exam results within 24 hours. Now, if within 24 hours you don't get the right result, make sure that you've recorded the areas where you realized you're a little bit weak, and then go back and immediately review those areas, and then build up more confidence in those areas, strengthen yourself in those areas, and then don't leave it too long before you take that second resit, because taking it earlier than later will keep you in mind of what you've already encountered, will allow you to get through those ones again quickly, and then to also, you know, hopefully solve the ones that you weren't so strong in the first retake. So ultimately, it comes down to your own confidence levels. Build confidence by doing preparation, by doing the hands-on exercises. You know, do the learning paths. It will put you in a good place. Okay, moving on to the next question. What if the internet is interrupted in the middle of the exam? Can I reconnect? The answer to that is yes. I've encountered that myself. So halfway through the exam, I did have a dropout. You go through the same connection processes as per the email you get in terms of the instructions to begin the exam session. You go through that. You'll be joined back to the same proctor. There is some intelligence in the systems that they use to take the exams in the background to join you back up with the same proctor. The proctor will have realized that you've dropped off for a period of time. If you drop off for, say, 5 minutes or 10 minutes, they will give you an extra 5 or 10 minutes to complete the exam. Like I say, I've had that happen to myself, and I know of other colleagues where that's happened. It can happen at your end. It tends to be more likely the case that it will happen at your end than at their end. But don't be stressed. If it does happen, you can recover, and you will not lose time. Okay, a couple of other questions before we finish. Can I only use the Kubernetes Playground once? So within Cloud Academy, we provide a Kubernetes Playground environment as part of one of our labs. You can use it as many times as possible. Also, keep in mind, when you sign up for the CKAD exam, or any of the Kubernetes exams for that matter, they do provide you with access to another exam simulation environment. And it's recommended that you actually not only use you know, what we provide, what Cloud Academy provides, but use all those other resources that are provided as well. The more that you can prepare, the better chance you've got in passing. And also keep in mind the tip that I provided earlier on, which is to install Minikube and do as much investigation and playing around within your own locally hosted Minikube Kubernetes cluster session. The more you can prepare, the better you'll build your confidence and the better you'll go in and crush the CKAD exam. Okay, another question. How many questions are on the exam and how many are needed to pass? So the official statement, when you look up the FAQ on the Linux Foundation for CKAD, I believe the official statement is they say you can expect between 15 and 19 questions or 15 and 20 questions. The reality is, based on what I saw when I sat it, I got 17 questions. But the official statement is to expect between 15 and I can't remember what the high number was. It was either 19 or 20. But in all reality, expect to encounter 17 questions. And in terms of a pass mark, you need 66%. So in terms of the number of questions, there is no hard and fast rule in terms of number of questions you need to pass. Keep in mind that each question has a different, contributes differently to the overall pass mark. So some questions will have a 2% weighting, some questions will have a 5% weighting, some will have an 8% weighting. Again, I can't remember what the high level weighting is. I think it's 10%, maybe 11%. But different questions have different weightings and therefore contribute differently to the overall pass mark. The overall pass mark is measured in percentage, and it's 66%. You'll get, so when you complete the exam, they will do grading for the next 24 hours. You will receive an email pretty much on the 24-hour turnaround time frame, and that will tell you whether you pass or not. They'll also tell you what your overall percentage mark was. They won't tell you which areas you scored in. You'll just get a percentage mark. So it's important to keep track of areas where you think you were weak in. Record those after the exam session completes, and review those. Take time to review them, and review them as quickly as possible. Okay. Do you know, so another question, do you know the weight by reading the question? Yes. So every question when presented will tell you what weighting is recorded on it. So that is definitely given. And that helps you to, depending on the exam answering strategy you've employed, that may influence whether you decide to park up a question or to answer a question. And then to, if you've parked up questions, when you get to the end of the full question set, go back and answer those particular questions you parked up. Different people use different exam strategies. Some will basically skip the lower weighted questions and go directly to the higher weighted questions. Others will do, just go through it sequentially. I used a mixture of both, as earlier mentioned. In terms of exams answering strategy, go with whatever works for yourself. Okay, next question. What's the average marks achieved by most of the participants? It's a good question. I don't think there's an officially released answer to that, but I will provide my version of an answer based on what I know my colleagues kind of achieve in the exam. So most of ourselves will achieve kind of in the higher 80s. It's not unreasonable to kind of score between 75% to the high 80s. There's one or two questions that will be reasonably challenging. they will probably how do you put it, separate, the experts from, the intermediate, advanced users of Kubernetes. Those types of questions. There's only a couple of very difficult ones. They were the ones that give you that last 10% that help you score. I've heard of a few people scoring 100%, but I would say most people kind of score in the mid 70s up to the high 80s. Okay, that's all of the questions for now. Next steps. I'll just summarize again, go through the fundamentals. Cloud Academy provides some really great theory-based learning content in the following learning paths. We also have a whole heap of hands-on labs. You can retake these as many times as possible, and these will get you in a really good place and will help build your confidence in terms of doing the solutioning required in the exams to pass. Remember the following links. Practice, install Minikube locally. Make sure you install version 1.22 as that's the version currently used for the Kubernetes CKAD exam. The bookmarks, export, don't forget that I've made that available in the following GitHub link. And then there's also some third-party CKAD questions provided in the last link as seen here. Okay, that's all for now. On behalf of Cloud Academy, I'd like to thank you for your participation in this webinar. I'd like to reiterate all feedback is welcome. Please fill out our end of webinar survey. It pops up once the webinar ends. It's not an email. If you have any unanswered questions about the content provided within this webinar, or you would like to see and hear of other related CKAD features, then by all means reach out to me either using our support email or hit me up on LinkedIn. This recording and slides will be made available shortly afterwards for your own on-demand viewing. For now, that's all, and on behalf of Cloud Academy, we wish you the very best of luck with your CKAD exam. Prepare well and crush it.